Lord Norman Foster is here. Architecture critic Paul Goldberger once called him the Mozart of modernism. Over the course of a 6-decade career, he has become one of the world's most revered and prolific architects. His iconic structures include the Gherkin Building, London City Hall, and the HSBC Building in Hong Kong. In 2009, Steve Jobs of Apple chose Foster and his firm to design the new Apple headquarters, which opened in April. He also recently launched the Norman Foster Foundation in Madrid. It promotes interdisciplinary thinking and research to help new generations of architects and designers anticipate the future. I am pleased to have Norman Foster back at this table. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Tell me about, you've done some buildings, had done some designing for Steve Jobs with respect to some of the stores before you began to think about?
No, that's come later.
That came later.
No, the campus, the main building, Steve's vision for the future, that was the start.
How did the two of you come together? Norman Foster, Steve Jobs.
He called me out of the blue, directly, and said, "Hi, Norman, I need some help. Can you come over? How quickly can you get here?"
Yes.
And I was there a few weeks later, and what was going to be an hour's meeting, 2 hours meeting, just took over the whole day. So from the beginning to the end, finished in the kitchen over pizza with families. It was total immersion.
Immersion in what?
In really Steve's vision for his project. And he described the materials, stone and glass, the California landscape of his youth. And together we talked about that. He talked about the citrus groves, the fruit bowl of his youth. I suggested that maybe those could be incorporated into a landscape. He loved the idea. And then we went to Pixar, which in many kind of ways was different, but was relevant to the conversation. So it was a very intensive day. And if I do a word picture of the conversation of that day, you can relate it very directly to the building as it is now. He even talked about a theater for 1,000 people.
Yeah. Where he could make presentations and all the stuff that he did on an annual basis. What did you make of him?
I thought that he was remarkable in that he could think about the big picture and be on his hands and knees worrying about the detail of a socket and a plug. So that ability, which I admire it in an architect, in any great thinker, strategist, that ability for the headlines and the fine print.
Now, people who know him well say that he married almost uniquely art and technology.
I'd say that was a pretty good description. He was, in a way, totally about the future, focused. Shortly after he passed away, I had to present the scheme to the top 100 in Apple. And my opening image was a quote from Steve: "Don't think of me as the client, think of me as a member of the team." And he was creative.
And then we now have what's called the circle, or the ring, the ring. Did he talk about that idea of the ring?
No. What is kind of below the surface was the way in which the project evolved. The circle came relatively late in the process, and the circle emerged out of a dialogue between his perfect vision for something called a pod, which was essentially a team space with monastic-like cells on the side, so that the individual could have a degree of concentration, but there would be the communality of the team space. And that had certain dimensional constraints. And then there was the big picture of the building in the landscape. And it started off like his vision of Stamford with its social space. It started with a heart as a landscape space. It kind of became rectangle squares. Then we moved into circles. Then there was something called the propeller scheme. And at one point, there was this crisis. We could not reconcile the ideal interior with the ideal exterior. And then kind of click. The circle came, and it was, it was one of those eureka moments. But it came out of a long process. It wasn't an immediate one-liner.
He wanted to eliminate the barrier between building and nature.
That was really, I think, part of that vision from the start. So, and when he had the opportunity to get the adjoining site, then all of a sudden 175 acres offered itself as a prospect. I mean, 10,000 trees, 5 miles of track, and something that would be shared by not just the people in the main building, but all the other, the team of Apple in the neighborhood.
I want to show some photographs and you'll recognize them. Tell me what I'm seeing there.
That is the 1,000-seat presentation theatre, and it is a disc, a carbon fibre disc, floating without visible structure. The glass drum is the structure. So structural glass and everything kind of hidden in those joints. So really doing more with less.
Next slide.
These are the eyebrows, the canopies. Yeah. They're extending the interior space out into the landscape. You can see they're highly reflective. So that green landscape is being mirrored into the space. Above, they're acting as light shelves for main areas of the facade, shading, reducing glare, but giving a kind of unique identity to this building.
Where did the glass come from?
The glass came from a variety. I mean, it was processed. It came from Germany, China. 3 buildings were created for this project, and a new industry arose in California, in Sacramento. So,
why only 4 stories?
Ease of communication, walk up.
You wanted people to walk around and see each other.
Yes. The building is about communication. It's described as a very large building, but I call it a compact building because if you think of the original campus, 26 buildings, you dissolve them into one. Everybody's under one roof. This is great for creativity, for communication, and you can link vertically and horizontally. So it's a very friendly building.
One of the last public appearances he made was before the Cupertino City Council.
Yes.
To make the case for the building.
And he made it, I mean, so elegantly, so eloquently.
What's your best memory of him?
Best memory of him is of somebody who was intense, dedicated, focused, sense of humor, a very warm, a very human person.
What does he share with Michael Bloomberg, who you've just done a building for, in the process of doing a building in London?
Individuals, very different. Buildings, very different. You couldn't be more far away from California than in the heart of the financial square mile of the City of London. But 2 individuals, totally hand-on. I mean, so many individuals in that position would be delegating down to project managers, and 2 individuals wonderfully opinionated in terms of the way that their organization should work, and prepared to make the effort and to be demanding.
Do you want a client to tell you exactly what they want, or do you want them simply to outline it so that you can give it the structure, that it gives you the freedom to come back?
The more information that you can have, the more you can respond to the very special needs of that organization through that individual. So really you want somebody who has strong views but has an open mind, and you can play a kind of intellectual ping pong. You can show ideas. They can be rejected, absorbed, transformed. But out of that process comes something that is very tailored to that organization, but ideally also has within it flexibility for change.
I've said this 1,000 times. Mike Nichols once said, Mike Nichols, a film director, asked him what he expected from actors. He said, I expect the same thing from actors that I expect from my architect. I want them to surprise me.
Absolutely. And I think that in that sense, when that relationship is really working on a one-to-one, and you have teams, and that becomes kind of one team, then the element of surprise is.
And what was the vision of Michael Bloomberg for his office tower in the heart of London?
He described it as fitting in, and that was obviously the way in which the building would appear from the outside. I think that the building is radical in the way that it breathes. It's naturally ventilated, also like Apple in that respect. And they're both deep buildings, so this is really pioneering. But Mike's building, remember, is on very busy, noisy, polluted streets. So to pull the air through that building, to filter it, to reduce the noise level, that's really quite a challenge. And using traditional materials, that building really does fit in. And Mike, you had the potential of going much higher. So it's low in the cityscape. I mean, it really, but at the same time, it's giving a lot back to the community. It's creating an arcade, a public route, the main route from the metro station on the line of the historic Watling Street. So it's referring to history.
This building was on top of this site, had beneath it Roman ruins.
With an incredible treasure trove. I mean, thousands of pieces of leather, gold, tablets, extraordinary collection. And it kind of encloses a Roman temple, the Temple of Mithras, and a metro station below it, as well as shops and restaurants.
How did you fit this building in with the surrounding building?
Really knitting it in, learning from history, continuing the line of streets, working with history, but at the same time, a similar parallel to the Apple building. The building was also driven by how Bloomberg works, which is a unique organization in so many ways. So big floor plates, good communication, the ability to look across a space and see somebody.
Yeah, I think you said, or Mike said, or it has been said about both of you, that an office should not be about work alone. It should be about lifestyle and heart and other things.
I've been pioneering that for as long as I can remember, ever since I was an office boy, a long time
Because
back.
you believe offices should not be a place where you go in and close the door and don't speak to anybody.
They're about lifestyle. Yeah. And remember that as the catchment becomes more and more difficult, people are going where the good lifestyle is, where, and a healthy building. So these are... they were subjective beliefs, perhaps decades ago, but scientific research has shown that the environment within a building, it can make you healthy, it can make you more alert, it can make you more productive.
What other architects in the world of star architects and people who have large names like you do, who reflects, you think, closest your views about architecture and about design?
I think for me, the people from the past, like Buckminster Fuller, I mean, as an individual, arguably the first green architect, the first person to draw attention to the fragility of the planet, which happened about the same time as the space race, when you were getting the first photographs of planet Earth, which, of course, Bucky coined. So I think... And in a way, individuals like Amory Lovins with his Rocky Mountain Institute, who in the 80s was demonstrating sustainability. His house, high in Colorado, above the snow line, with banana trees and no energy input, and beautifully comfortable.
With the changing demands of how we get energy, does that present changing demands for architects?
I think it presents extraordinary opportunities. I mean, the way in which we're seeing the price of solar. I mean, here the optimists are in the ascendancy. I mean, predicted by 2030 it will be cheaper than coal. And you're seeing those economies which have a high dependence on fossil fuels, realizing that. And China is investing heavily, not just in solar. 2/3 of the solar panels in the world come out of China, half the wind turbines. And the biggest investment...
Many people worry about that. They'll be so far ahead of us in the technology.
But look at the investment
alternative energy sources.
Yes, look at the investment in battery plants. You have 2 in America, 1 in Europe. You have 10 in China, either under construction or operating.
But how does this change the architecture?
Well, we know. I mean, there's a solar prize in my name in Switzerland, and one recent prize winner generates 238% of the energy that it needs. So it's feeding back energy into the national grid. Apple, incidentally, is absorbing more carbon dioxide through those trees, 200 tons a year, and it's carbon neutral as a building. It's totally energy sufficient.
There's so many projects around the world. How do you do it?
I'm able to focus myself on a number of projects. I'm able to overview a wider range of projects, and I have just a fantastic team.
You once said, though, that architects have no power.
Only the power of advocacy, the power to be able to use rational argument and to confront the options and to point the way that small differences, small interventions can make a huge difference.
You also said, though, that there are a lot of fantasies about architects. What fantasies are there?
I think that we had this event in Madrid, and it was a multidisciplinary lineup in the spirit of the foundation. It was created by the foundation. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, if this forum succeeded with something like 1,500 students there from various professions, in making everybody realize that architecture is not just about making fancy shapes, that it's really a core activity, that design is a core activity. It's not about frivolities, it's really about something.
But is it fine art?
It's art, it's also about practicality, it's about responding to the issues of the day.
That's a great balance in it between, as Steve was talking about technology and...
It's a balancing act, but it should lift the spirits, it should make you feel better. It's not just about keeping out the rain.
The functionality of it all is not alone. It should touch your spirit in a sense that you walk in a building that has been thought through and you feel a sense of an emotion about being there.
You should feel
you're
good.
Inspired to
you should want to come back. You should want to stay. Of course, I think there's a wider world of shelter. Remember that one in 3 of the urban settlements by 2050 will be so-called informal settlement, which is a very kind of posh way of saying it won't have clean water, it won't have sanitation, it won't have power. So in a way, the design community needs to join with others, I think, to address those needs.
You have been signaled out for, I think the words they used are lightness and grace. Does that mean something to you?
I'd be enormously flattered. I mean, I think that the best architecture for me is about light and lightness. It doesn't mean to say that I don't enjoy those buildings which are more solid. But if you go back in time to the cathedrals, they were in pursuit of light and lightness, even though they were made of heavy stone. They stretched the boundaries.
And also the exploration of weight is an interesting idea.
Yes, the concept of doing more with less. And arguably, that's what we have to do as cities. We have to achieve more with less energy and less pollution.
And what's the relationship between architecture and urban planning?
For me, there's a total fusion. I can't separate the individual building from the kind of urban glue, the public spaces, the bridges, the mass transit. Our experience of a city transcends the individual building, and it's the combination of the buildings, the infrastructure. That's where the energy is consumed that's where the greenhouse gases are being emitted. So we have to make that cleaner. The production of energy has to be cleaner.
How do you stay informed?
By trying to prepare myself for events like the one last week in Madrid. But I think it's a curiosity. And in that sense, I'm as much a student as I was when I was at Manchester, however many decades ago. So,
speaking of Manchester, I mean, everybody's heart went out when they got up and realized what had happened there. Do you return to Manchester? Have you stayed close to the city?
I go back. The last time I went back, I gave a talk in Manchester Town Hall, which is where I worked as a youth. And I talked about the so-called Northern Powerhouse. And I sought to elaborate ways in which, through communication, you could spread prosperity, how it could have greater connectivity with the South, and the way in which the Pennines was a barrier, and you could do a route around it. I evoked the work that we'd done in Bilbao and in the Ruhr Valley. So, yes, I do go back.
But you came from, as I understand, middle-class family background.
I don't think it was more a working-class background, but I had fantastic parents. And
did you set out to become an architect? Was that an early inspiration?
I'd always been interested in buildings. I mean, when I worked at Manchester Town Hall, I would walk around at the lunchtime and I would look at buildings. And I was, but it was only later that I realized the possibility of going to university to study architecture. But it
was the love of buildings that did it.
It was interesting also that in the archive, I didn't realize it was there, but somebody who'd been going through it said, "Did you see the book that you did when you were 13 years old?" And there's a description of curtained walls. And I'd forgotten it completely. So it's been an obsession, building, since childhood.
And what is it that between you and gray, the color gray?
I'm not at all sure that it's, there's a theme of greys and silvers and whites that weave their way through the buildings. But there are also those buildings which have colours of nature. I mean, Willis Faber, for example, is about the sunshine of yellow, the green of grass. So I think that in the same way you can categorize the buildings as skin and bones. If you take the Bloomberg building, it's very muscular, which is very much expresses its structure in stone, picks up the rhythms of the streets. Apple, on the other hand, is very much an expression of the skin of the building. So I think that there are these themes which weave through the architecture.
Which brings me to the foundation that's in Madrid. What's the driving idea about this foundation?
As you summarized at the beginning, it's about younger generations. It's
looking
about
to the future.
Yes, looking to the future. As a student, I was fortunate to win scholarships. I had a Henry Fellowship that took me to Yale University. I was able, during the summer vacations, to win scholarships to travel. And when I won the Pritzker Prize, the prize money went into a kitty, and that was really the start of somehow also trying to give something back, but with a focus. I mean, creating traveling fellowships, enabling students who don't have the means, the Bartlett School, for example, to have their tuition paid for the course, but really with more of a focus on the things that, in a way, I've accumulated over those 6.5 decades, which produces an archive, a think tank, a base for people to come together, and events such as the one that you talked about in Madrid. So pointing the way for younger generations who will be have the responsibility for those issues, those big issues.
As you know, I mean, New York has often been a venue for a lot of conversations about the future of architecture. And And yet, I'm reading about your foundation. Part of what you want there is to capture the heartbeat of architecture and how it can serve the future.
Yes, and architecture and infrastructure and agriculture and transportation. I mean, we're on the edge of revolutions. I mean, the car as we know it today will probably be totally obsolete by 2030. And will you be taking a
Driverless car.
Yeah, or will you be taking a hovercraft? Will you be taking a drone?
Well, they're about ready to test in California a flying automobile.
So, I mean, what was science fiction in my youth is now the edge of reality.
And architecture is more now identified in terms of a kind of a holistic idea with the larger forces at work.
I've always been pursuing a holistic view. I mean, in the 1960s and 70s, green planning, green buildings, buildings that breathe. Now we're realizing them. That was a green architecture before the word had been coined.
When you travel around the world, I mean, it seems to me that as I follow what is being discussed in forum and conferences and things like that, I mean, urbanism is getting and more people are drawn to urban life and urban areas, whether it's China as a developing country or whether it's places like, Paris and London, a sense of the quality of life in urban areas.
The future of society is the city. I mean, by 2050, it's estimated that 75% of humanity will be living in cities. And if we're talking about global warming, remember that 70% of the world's cities are on the coast, and 50% of humanity is within 100 kilometers of the coast.
And puts them at risk.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's not just the polar bear sitting on an iceberg.
When you talk to young architects, what is it they want? Are they different today than they were when you were 30?
I think that they're possibly more concerned about the future.
The world around them.
Yes.
Because there's more of an awareness about it. It's become a political issue.
There's a heightened sense of awareness. And I think that was the power of the forum last week, to draw students from really all over.
To come look at the future of architecture in the world.
It was a friend who looked down at the long lines of students waiting to get in. And this friend said, why they're here? It's about the future, and they're worried about their future. So I think you're right. I think there is that.
Even here among non-architecture students, among millennials, there is a great sense that we see in terms of wanting to have a more direct connection to the politics of their time.
I think the important thing, though, to get across is bringing together different disciplines, working together from the outset in a holistic
cross-disciplinary approach to problem solving.
That's critical. And that's one of the main missions of the foundation.
You're young at heart. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.